My grandmother locked me in her bedroom every Friday at midnight. I finally know what was happening downstairs. The ritual started when I turned 8 years old. Every Friday night, Grandmother Irene would take my hand at exactly 11:55 and lead me up the narrow staircase to her bedroom on the second floor. She'd give me milk and cookies, tuck me into her four-poster bed that smelled like lavender and mothballs, then lock the door from the outside. The key would click in the old brass lock and I'd hear her footsteps descending the stairs. I'd wake up Saturday morning to find the door unlocked and Grandmother making breakfast like nothing unusual had happened. This went on every single Friday for 6 years until I turned 14, and my mother finally took me away from that house. I'm 32 now. Grandmother Irene died last week at 89 years old, and I found myself standing in her house for the first time in 18 years. My mother refused to attend the funeral or help with the estate, so the responsibility fell to me as the only living relative willing to deal with her belongings. The house looked exactly the same. Same floral wallpaper, same creaking floorboards, same smell of lavender that made my stomach clench with memories I'd spent years trying to forget. The bedroom door at the top of the stairs still had the brass lock, and seeing it made my hands shake. The lawyer handling the estate had given me a box of personal documents. Inside was Grandmother's journal, leather-bound and heavy, with entries dating back 40 years. I'd started reading it that first night while sitting in her living room, surrounded by furniture covered in white sheets. The early entries were mundane, shopping lists and doctor appointments and complaints about neighbors. Then I reached an entry from 1996, the year I was born, and the tone changed completely. She'd written, "The child arrived today. My daughter brought shame upon this house, and now I must carry the burden of her sin. But perhaps this grandchild can serve a greater purpose. Perhaps this is divine providence." I didn't understand what she meant. My mother had been a single parent, and Grandmother had taken us in when I was young. But I'd never understood why she'd always seemed to resent my existence. I kept reading and found an entry from my 8th birthday. "The time has come to begin his preparation. Every Friday at midnight, the congregation requires fresh commitment, and the boy must be protected from witnessing what his presence demands. I will keep him safe in my room while we conduct the necessary business downstairs. He must never know the price of his existence." My blood went cold reading those words. I searched through more entries and found detailed descriptions of Friday night gatherings. Grandmother called them cleansing ceremonies. She'd written about how 15 members of their group would arrive at midnight through the back entrance, all wearing dark clothes and masks. They'd gather in the basement, which I'd never been allowed to enter, and conduct rituals that she described in disturbing detail. Symbols drawn in salt, candles arranged in specific patterns, chanting in languages I didn't recognize even now. She'd written that the ceremonies were necessary to maintain balance, to keep something contained that wanted to break free. One entry from when I was 10 years old made me physically ill. The boy asked why I lock him in my room every Friday. I told him I was protecting him from burglars who target houses on weekends. He believed me because children are trusting and simple. He doesn't understand that the ceremonies downstairs are happening because of him, that his bloodline carries a debt that must be paid weekly to prevent catastrophe. The others wanted to include him in the rituals once he was old enough, but I refused. He will never know what we do to keep him in this town safe from what his great-grandfather unleashed. I put the journal down and walked through the house trying to process what I'd read. My great-grandfather had been a minister who'd died long before I was born. Family legend said he'd been a good man who'd served the community faithfully, but Grandmother's journal painted a different picture. She'd written that he'd practiced dark magic, that he'd opened some kind of doorway in the basement of this house during a ritual gone wrong, and that his descendants were cursed to maintain seals that kept whatever he'd summoned from breaking through into our world. The basement door was in the kitchen, painted white and looking completely ordinary. I'd tried the handle as a child countless times, but it had always been locked. Now I stood in front of it holding Grandmother's keyring, my heart pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I found a key that looked old enough to match the door and slid it into the lock. It turned easily. The door opened onto darkness and stairs descending into cold air that smelled like earth and something chemical I couldn't identify. I'd found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and started down. The basement was larger than I'd expected, extending beyond the footprint of the house above. The concrete floor was covered in chalk marks that formed intricate geometric patterns. Candles were arranged in circles around the space, hundreds of them in various states of melting. The walls were covered in symbols painted in what looked like rust-colored paint, though part of me knew it probably wasn't paint at all. In the center of the largest circle was a trapdoor built into the floor, secured with multiple padlocks and chains. Something about that trapdoor made my skin crawl. I'd found a folder on a workbench against the wall containing typed documents. The first page was titled Covenant of Containment and listed 15 names including Grandmother Irene's. Below the names was a contract describing their commitment to perform weekly rituals to maintain supernatural barriers. The document claimed that Reverend Augustus Hartwell, my great-grandfather, had successfully summoned an entity in 1952, but had lost control of it. The entity had killed 3 people before being trapped beneath the house. The survivors had formed this group to ensure it remained contained through regular ceremonies that reinforced the seals. According to the documents, the entity fed on bloodline energy from Reverend Hartwell's descendants. My mother had been subjected to the ceremonies as a child until she'd run away at 17. When she'd returned years later with me, grandmother had seen it as an opportunity to continue the containment using the next generation. The Friday ceremonies involved using my presence in the house, even locked upstairs, to channel energy into the seals. I'd essentially been a battery powering supernatural restraints while sleeping in my grandmother's bed. I'd found photographs in another folder showing the ceremony participants. They were all people I recognized from my childhood. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd run the corner store, Mr. Brennan, who'd been the elementary school principal, Dr. Vaughn, who'd been our family physician, all of them wearing black robes and masks, standing around the basement circles. One photo showed them holding hands around the trap door while grandmother stood at the head with her arms raised. The date on the back was from when I was 9 years old. My phone rang, and I'd nearly dropped the flashlight. It was Detective Lisa Moreno from the local police department. She'd said someone had reported seeing lights in grandmother's house and asked if I was there going through her belongings. I'd confirmed I was, and she'd asked if I'd found anything unusual. Something in her tone made me cautious. I'd said I was just sorting through old furniture and papers. She'd been quiet for a moment before saying, if I found anything related to Friday night activities, I should call her immediately. Then she'd hung up. I'd gone back upstairs and searched online for Detective Moreno. She'd been with the department for 12 years, specialized in cold cases. I'd found several news articles mentioning her investigation into disappearances from the late 1990s and early 2000s. 3 people had vanished from our town during those years without any trace. The articles mentioned that families claimed the missing people had been involved with a secretive group, but no evidence of such a group was ever found. The most recent disappearance had been in 2004, 2 years before my mother had taken me away from grandmother's house. I'd called my mother for the first time in 6 months. She'd answered on the 5th ring, her voice sharp with suspicion. I'd asked her why she'd really taken me away from grandmother's house all those years ago. She'd been silent for so long I'd thought she hung up. Then she'd said she'd discovered what was happening in the basement. She'd snuck back to the house one Friday night after supposedly moving out and had seen the ceremony through a basement window. She'd watched 15 people chanting around the trap door while I'd slept upstairs, unknowingly fueling their ritual. That's when she'd grabbed me in the middle of the night and driven 3 states away. My mother said she'd tried to report it to police, but they'd dismissed her as mentally unstable. Several officers had been friends with grandmother and the other ceremony participants. She'd said when she'd pushed harder, she'd started receiving threats. Photos of me at my new school, notes saying accidents happened to children of troublemakers. She'd finally stopped trying to expose them because she'd been terrified they'd kill me to silence her. She'd raised me in isolation, changing our names and moving every few years. I'd always thought she was paranoid. Now I understood she'd been protecting me from people who'd already proven they'd kill to keep their secret. I'd asked her about my great-grandfather and what he'd actually summoned. She'd said grandmother had told her once when she was drunk. Reverend Hartwell had been obsessed with contacting the dead, believing he could create a bridge between worlds that would prove the existence of an afterlife. He'd studied forbidden texts and conducted experiments in the basement. On October 13, 1952, he'd succeeded in opening a doorway, but what came through wasn't a peaceful spirit. It was something that hungered for human life. It had killed Reverend Hartwell's wife and 2 church deacons before the Reverend managed to trap it under the house with a seal powered by his own blood. The seal required constant reinforcement using bloodline energy from Hartwell's descendants. My grandmother had been forced into the maintenance rituals as a teenager. When she'd had my mother, she'd eventually brought her into it too. The group believed if they ever stopped the ceremonies, the entity would break free and kill everyone in town. They'd convinced themselves they were heroes, making a necessary sacrifice. My mother said the truth was, they were a cult that had built their identities around containing a monster that probably could have been dealt with properly if they'd sought actual help decades ago. But then, my mother said something that stopped me cold. She'd asked if I'd found a second journal. Grandmother had kept 2, she'd said. One for official ceremony records and one where she wrote what she actually believed. My mother had seen it once as a child, hidden behind a loose brick in the basement fireplace. She'd said grandmother's private journal contained doubts about whether the entity was real or if they'd all been maintaining her father's delusion for decades. That journal was the real reason my mother had been so desperate to escape, because it meant they'd been sacrificing everything for nothing. I'd gone back down to the basement and found the fireplace, cold and filled with old ashes. I'd started pulling at bricks until one came loose. Behind it was a metal box containing another journal, this one smaller and water-damaged. I'd opened it to find grandmother's handwriting, shakier and more frantic than in the official journal. The first entry I read made my stomach turn. Father died today, and with his last breath, he told me the truth. There is no entity. There never was. He killed Mother and the deacons during a psychotic episode and built the containment story to cope with what he'd done. He's been maintaining the delusion for 30 years, and we've all believed him. The next entry was dated 3 days later. I told the others what Father confessed. Half of them refused to believe me. They said Father was delirious at the end, that of course there's an entity because we felt its presence during ceremonies. But I know the truth now. We've been performing rituals for nothing, maintaining a shared delusion because it gives us purpose and binds us together. The question is whether I have the courage to end it, or if I'll continue the lie for my own daughter. She'd continued the lie for another 50 years. I'd photographed every page of both journals with my phone and was about to leave when I heard a car pull up outside. Through the basement window, I'd watched 4 people get out and walk toward the back door. I'd recognized one of them, Mr. Brennan's son, who was now in his 50s. They'd used a key to enter, and I'd heard them walking through the house above me. One voice said they needed to check if the new bloodline carrier had discovered anything. Another said the ceremonies must continue now that Irene was gone, that 70 years of containment couldn't end just because one generation died. I'd realized these people didn't know the truth. They were still maintaining the delusion, even though grandmother had known it was fake for decades. I'd quietly moved to the trap door and examined the padlocks more closely. They were new, installed within the past few months based on the shiny metal and lack of rust. Someone had been down here recently. I'd pulled out my phone to call Detective Moreno when I'd noticed something scratched into the concrete next to the trapdoor. Fresh scratches that read, "Help me, I'm still alive down here. Day 6. My hands had started shaking. Someone was trapped under the trapdoor. I'd grabbed a crowbar I'd seen earlier and started working on the padlocks. The voices upstairs were getting closer, arguing about whether to search the basement. The first padlock broke, and I'd moved to the second when someone had shouted my name from the top of the basement stairs. It was Mr. Brennan's son, his voice friendly, but with an edge. He'd said we needed to talk about my inheritance and responsibilities. He'd said the covenant required a Hartwell descendant to participate in the Friday ceremonies. I'd broken the second padlock, 3 more to go. Footsteps descended the stairs, and I'd worked faster, the crowbar slipping in my sweaty hands. A flashlight beam had hit me, and someone had yelled for me to stop. I'd broken the 3rd padlock as 2 men rushed toward me. The 4th lock snapped, and I'd pulled open the trapdoor just as hands grabbed my shoulders. Below was darkness, and a ladder descending into a shaft. And from that darkness came a voice, weak and desperate, saying, "Please, I've been down here since last Friday. They locked me in when I tried to leave the group." The men had pulled me away from the trapdoor, but I'd fought back, swinging the crowbar. One of them had stumbled backward into the ceremony circles. The other had shouted for help, and more people had come running down the stairs. I'd looked into the shaft and seen a face looking up, pale and terrified. A woman, maybe in her 30s, with matted hair and dried blood on her face. She'd started climbing the ladder, and the group had realized what was happening. Someone had shouted that she was supposed to stay contained until she agreed to maintain her vows. Detective Moreno had burst through the back door at that moment with 4 officers. She'd had her gun drawn and was shouting for everyone to freeze. The group had scattered, some trying to run up the stairs while others backed into corners. The woman from the shaft had emerged fully, collapsing on the basement floor and gasping that they'd kept her down there for 6 days without food, torturing her with recordings of fake entity sounds to break her will. She'd said her name was Rebecca Sutton, and she'd been part of the group for 5 years before discovering the truth. Detective Moreno had arrested everyone in the basement while calling for ambulances. Rebecca had been taken to the hospital for dehydration and injuries. I'd stayed to give my statement, showing Detective Moreno both journals and the photographs I'd taken. She'd said Rebecca had filed a missing persons report through her sister in another state, claiming she'd been kidnapped by a cult. The local police had dismissed it as family drama, because Rebecca had been seen around town the day before she'd disappeared. Nobody had thought to check grandmother's basement, but the investigation revealed something worse. In the shaft below the trap door, crime scene investigators found 3 skeletons. All were identified through dental records as the missing people from the cold cases. They hadn't escaped the group. They'd been killed and hidden in the chamber, their deaths used to reinforce the entity story. The group had told members that these people had been sacrificed to feed the entity when they'd tried to break the covenant. It kept everyone else compliant through fear. Detective Moreno had brought me to the station the next day to review evidence they'd found in Mr. Brennan's home. He'd kept detailed records of the group's activities, including financial transactions showing that members had been paying monthly dues for decades. The money was supposed to fund ceremony supplies and maintenance of the containment seals. Instead, it had been funneled into personal accounts. Grandmother Irene had embezzled over $2 million over 40 years. Dr. Vaughn's daughter had been writing fake prescriptions and billing insurance companies fraudulently. The ceremonies had been cover for organized crime. I'd asked Detective Moreno how this had gone on for so long without anyone noticing. She'd said small towns protect their own, especially when those people hold positions of authority. The group had included a police captain who'd retired in 2010, a county judge who'd died in 2015, a bank president, a school superintendent. They'd used their positions to suppress investigations and discredit anyone who asked questions. My mother had been labeled mentally ill when she'd tried to expose them. Rebecca's family had been told she was unstable when she'd disappeared. The trial started 6 months later. Rebecca testified about her captivity in the shaft, how they'd lowered food and water just enough to keep her alive while playing recordings meant to sound like demonic entities. They'd told her she was being punished for doubting the covenant, and that the entity was demanding her suffering as payment. She'd said the psychological torture had been worse than the physical conditions, because part of her had started to believe maybe the entity was real, and she'd doomed the town by trying to leave. Mr. Ada Brennan's son had been the main orchestrator of Rebecca's imprisonment. He'd testified that they'd only meant to scare her back into compliance, not actually harm her. The prosecution had presented evidence that this was the same method used on the 3 murdered victims. They'd been imprisoned in the shaft, tortured psychologically until they broke, then killed when they'd refused to return to the group. Their bodies had been left in the chamber as warnings that the entity consumed those who betrayed the covenant. My mother had attended every day of the trial. She'd testified about her own experiences being subjected to the ceremonies as a child, how they'd made her participate in rituals that involved cutting her palm to provide blood for the seals. She'd described watching me sleep upstairs through security cameras they'd installed, how they'd tracked my brainwaves during ceremonies to prove my presence was necessary for the rituals to work. The jury had looked horrified as she'd explained how they'd used pseudoscience and theatrical effects to maintain the illusion of supernatural activity. The defense had tried to argue that the group had genuinely believed in the entity and had killed only to protect the town from catastrophic harm, but the prosecution had introduced grandmother's private journal, proving that she'd known the truth for decades and had maintained the fraud deliberately. They'd presented financial records showing systematic embezzlement and insurance fraud. They'd shown emails where group members had discussed using the entity story to manipulate new recruits and extract money from believers. Mrs. Kowalski had been the most disturbing witness. At 91 years old, she'd testified that she'd known from the beginning that there was no entity. She'd been present the night Reverend Hartwell had killed his wife and the deacons during what she'd described as a drug-induced psychotic break. She'd helped him create the containment story and had spent 70 years maintaining the deception because it had given her power and purpose. She'd said the ceremonies had been the most important thing in her life, and she had no regrets about the people who died to protect the group's secrets. The verdicts came back guilty on all major charges. Mr. Brennan's son received life without parole for murder and kidnapping. Mrs. Kowalski received 25 years despite her age, the judge saying her decades of manipulation and murder warranted maximum sentencing. 4 others received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years for conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and accessory to murder. 2 members who'd cooperated with prosecution and testified against the others received reduced sentences and probation. But the trial revealed another twist that nobody had anticipated. The prosecutor had introduced evidence that my father, who I'd never met, had actually been a member of the group. He'd been recruited by grandmother after getting my mother pregnant, and he'd participated in ceremonies for 2 years before disappearing when I was a baby. Missing persons reports from 1998 had never been resolved. During excavation of grandmother's property, investigators found a 4th skeleton buried separately from the others. Dental records confirmed it was my father. My mother had collapsed when they'd told her. She'd said she'd always assumed he'd abandoned us, that he'd decided fatherhood was too much responsibility. Learning he'd been murdered had broken something in her. Detective Moreno had explained that grandmother's private journal contained an entry from 1998 where she'd written that my father had threatened to expose the group and take me away. The group had voted to eliminate him, claiming the entity had demanded his sacrifice. They'd killed him and told my mother he'd left town. She'd believed the lie for 34 years. I'd found my father's grave during the excavation and had stood there trying to process that the man I'd never known had died, trying to protect me from the same people who'd locked me in that bedroom every Friday. The forensic report had shown he'd been strangled and buried within days of his disappearance. Grandmother had written in her journal that his death had been necessary to maintain the covenant, but that she'd felt guilty enough to keep me away from the worst of the ceremonies. The bedroom ritual had been her compromise, using me for the ceremonies while preventing me from witnessing what they actually did. Rebecca had started a support group for survivors of cult manipulation and had invited me to attend. I'd met 6 other people who'd escaped various groups that had used supernatural claims to control members. One man had been part of a group that claimed to prevent alien invasions through meditation. A woman had been in a group that believed they were stopping volcanic eruptions through group chanting. All of them had described the same pattern: charismatic leaders, escalating commitments, isolation from outsiders, and eventually discovering the supernatural claims were covers for fraud and abuse. Rebecca had said the hardest part wasn't believing the lie, it was accepting how much of her life she'd wasted maintaining it. She'd given 5 years to the group, recruiting new members and participating in ceremonies she'd thought were saving the town. Learning it was all performance to cover embezzlement had shattered her sense of reality. She'd said therapy was helping, but she'd never trust her own judgment the same way again. I'd told her I understood, that finding those journals had made me question everything I'd believed about my childhood and my family. The house demolition happened on a cold morning in November. I'd stood with Detective Moreno and Rebecca watching the excavator tear down walls and crush the structure into rubble. The basement was filled in and covered with concrete, The property was sold to a developer who'd planned to build a community center. Detective Moreno had said she'd recommended a memorial for the victims, something to acknowledge what had happened without sensationalizing the cult aspects. The town council had agreed, though many residents wanted to pretend none of it had ever happened. My mother and I had started having weekly dinners, something we'd never done before. She'd apologized for raising me in isolation and paranoia, for changing our names every few years and refusing to let me have normal friendships. She'd said she'd been trying to keep me safe but had ended up traumatizing me in different ways. I'd told her I understood now why she'd made those choices, that she'd been protecting me from people who'd already killed my father and would have killed me too if they'd felt threatened. We'd agreed to start therapy together to process everything we'd learned. But the story didn't end with the trial. 3 months after sentencing, I'd received a package at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of. Inside was a journal that looked identical to grandmother's, but this one belonged to someone named Margaret Hartwell, my great-great-grandmother, Reverend Hartwell's mother. I'd opened it with shaking hands and read entries from the 1940s describing her son's descent into obsession with the occult. She'd written that Augustus hadn't been the first Hartwell to experiment with contacting the dead. Margaret's journal had explained that the Hartwell family had a history of mental illness spanning 5 generations. Her grandfather had claimed to speak with spirits. Her father had tried to open doorways to other dimensions. Augustus had continued the family tradition, but Margaret had written that she believed it was all delusion amplified by hereditary psychosis. She'd written that she'd tried to get Augustus psychiatric help, but he'd refused, convinced his research was legitimate. She'd predicted he would either die during an experiment or hurt someone else in the process. She'd been right on both counts. The journal's final entry had been dated October 12, 1952, one day before the incident that killed 3 people. Margaret had written that she'd confronted Augustus about his planned ceremony, that she'd threatened to have him committed if he went through with it. He'd responded by locking her in her room overnight. She'd heard screaming from the basement around midnight but couldn't get out. By morning, her daughter-in-law and 2 church members were dead, and Augustus was building the containment story. Margaret had written that she'd tried to expose the truth, but the survivors had been so traumatized they'd embraced Augustus's delusion rather than accepting he'd murdered people during a psychotic break. The last page of Margaret's journal had contained a warning written in different ink, clearly added years later. If you're reading this, you're my descendant, and you need to know the truth. There is no entity. There never was. It's madness that runs in our blood, madness that makes us see patterns where there are none, and meaning where there is only chaos. Augustus killed people because his mind broke and he couldn't accept responsibility. Don't let the lie continue. End it, before more people die for nothing. She'd signed it and dated it 1967, 3 years before her death. I'd called Detective Moreno immediately, and she'd come to my apartment to examine the journal. She'd said it answered questions about who'd sent it. Margaret Hartwell had given it to a lawyer with instructions to send it to any Hartwell descendant who exposed the cult. The law firm had been monitoring news coverage and had identified me as someone who'd fulfill Margaret's requirements. Detective Moreno had said this journal would be valuable evidence in appeals and civil cases against the group members. But the package had contained something else beneath the journal, a DNA test kit with a note saying, "You need to know the complete truth about your bloodline." I'd stared at it for a long time before deciding to use it. The results came back 6 weeks later and revealed something that recontextualized everything. Reverend Augustus Hartwell was not my biological great-grandfather. Grandmother Irene had been adopted as an infant, though she'd apparently never known this. Her biological father had been a man named Thomas Brennan, grandfather of the Mr. Brennan I'd known as a child. The Brennan family had given up a baby daughter in 1934 due to financial hardship. That baby had been adopted by Augustus and his wife Eleanor, raised as their own daughter without ever being told the truth, which meant I had no Hartwell blood at all. The entire premise of the ceremonies, that my bloodline energy was necessary for containment, had been based on a lie within a lie. I wasn't descended from the man who'd supposedly summoned the entity. I'd been locked in that room every Friday for 6 years because of mistaken identity compounded by decades of fraud. I'd confronted Mr. Brennan's son during his sentencing hearing with this information. He'd gone pale as I'd explained that his grandfather had been my actual great-great-grandfather, that we were distant cousins, that the Brennan family had spent decades maintaining a cult based on supernatural claims that required my participation when I wasn't even related to the person whose bloodline supposedly mattered. He'd started laughing, a broken, desperate sound that had made the judge call for order. He'd said it was perfect, that of course the entire foundation of everything they'd done was built on yet another lie. The revelation had sparked additional investigations into the Brennan family's role in creating and maintaining the cult. Prosecutors discovered that Thomas Brennan had known about his daughter being adopted by the Hartwells. He'd been present the night of the murders in 1952 and had helped Augustus create the containment story. He'd spent the rest of his life recruiting members and building the cult's power structure. His son had continued the tradition, and his grandson had been running the operation when it finally collapsed. 3 generations of Brennans had used the Hartwell name and supernatural claims to build a criminal enterprise. Rebecca had called me after reading about the DNA results in news coverage. She'd said learning the bloodline component was fake, had been the final piece she'd needed to fully accept that nothing about the cult had been real. She'd still been holding on to a tiny hope that maybe some part of it had been genuine, that her sacrifice and suffering had mattered for something. Now she knew it had all been performance and exploitation. She'd sounded relieved and devastated in equal measure. The civil suits against the group members and their estates lasted another year. Families of the murdered victims received settlements totaling $8 million from liquidated assets. Rebecca received compensation for her kidnapping and torture. My mother received restitution for the fraud committed against her throughout her childhood and young adulthood. I donated my portion to funding cult awareness and prevention programs, not wanting money that came from so much suffering and deception. The community center built on grandmother's former property had opened last month. It included a small memorial room with plaques honoring the victims and educational materials about recognizing and escaping cult manipulation. Detective Moreno had been appointed to the board overseeing the center's programming. Rebecca had developed workshops for teenagers about critical thinking and resisting group pressure. My mother had volunteered to speak at schools about her experiences growing up in a high-control group. I'd attended the opening ceremony and had stood in the room that now occupied the space where the basement had been. Clean white walls instead of symbols, bright lights instead of candles. Children playing in areas where people had once chanted around a trapdoor. Detective Moreno had said this was the best revenge against what the cult had built, transforming their space of deception and death into something that served the community genuinely. But I still think about those Friday nights sometimes. Being locked in that bedroom while grandmother and 14 others performed elaborate ceremonies to maintain a delusion started by a man suffering from hereditary mental illness, using me as an unwitting participant because they'd been wrong about who I was related to, killing anyone who threatened to expose them. All of it built on layers of lies, each generation adding new deceptions until the truth was buried so deep nobody could find it without burning everything down. The final twist came 6 months after the community center opened. A woman contacted me through the Cult Awareness Organization, claiming to be Augustus Hartwell's illegitimate daughter from an affair he'd had in the 1940s. She'd been raised by her mother and had only learned about Augustus after his death. She'd been following the news coverage and had evidence that Augustus had fathered at least 3 children outside his marriage, which meant there were actual Hartwell bloodline descendants living normal lives, completely unaware of the cult that had formed around their family name. I'd met with her and confirmed through DNA testing that we shared no relation, proving again that I'd never had Hartwell blood. But she'd shared letters from her mother describing Augustus as charismatic and troubled, someone who'd believed he could achieve great things, but whose mind had deteriorated over time. Her mother had left him when she'd realized he was becoming dangerous, taking their daughter and disappearing. She'd spent decades hiding from him, afraid he'd try to use their child in his experiments. She'd been right to run. The woman, whose name was Dorothy, had asked if she should reveal herself to the other descendants of Augustus's legitimate children. I told her the truth would only cause more pain for people who'd already suffered enough. She'd agreed and had asked that her information remain confidential. She'd said she wanted to help the cult awareness work, but didn't want her life consumed by her father's legacy of delusion and death. I'd understood completely. Detective Moreno closed her sister's case officially after 73 years. She'd finally been able to give her family closure and proof of what had happened. She'd told me once that finding the truth had been both healing and traumatic, because part of her had hoped her sister had run away and started a new life somewhere. Learning she'd been murdered and buried in grandmother's garden had ended that hope, but knowing was better than wondering forever. My mother and I planted a tree at the community center in memory of my father. The plaque said, "In memory of Michael Grayson, who died protecting those he loved from those who claimed to protect the town." We'd stood there after the ceremony and my mother had told me stories about him I'd never heard, how he'd been kind and funny, how he'd questioned the group's practices from the beginning, how he'd planned to take us away the week he'd disappeared, how he'd died because he'd chosen us over the cult. I work now as a consultant helping law enforcement identify and investigate suspected cult activity. I've trained officers in recognizing patterns of abuse and manipulation in high-control groups. I've testified in 3 cases where groups claimed religious freedom while committing fraud and abuse. Each time I explain how my grandmother locked me in her bedroom every Friday while conducting fake ceremonies to maintain a delusion that covered organized crime, I see recognition in people's eyes. They start to understand how seemingly normal community members can participate in extraordinary deception. Rebecca and I co-authored a book about our experiences that published last year. It detailed the psychology of cult belief and the mechanisms that keep people trapped even after they start doubting. We described how the Friday ceremonies had functioned as social control and shared delusion, how the supernatural claims had provided justification for increasingly criminal behavior, how the group had used my supposed bloodline connection to maintain cohesion and purpose. The book became required reading in several criminal justice programs. The last member of the original group died in prison 6 months ago. Mrs. Kowalski, 93 years old, who'd maintained until her death that the entity was real and that we doomed the town by exposing the covenant. The prison psychologist said she'd been genuinely unable to accept that 70 years of her life had been built on lies. She died still believing still warning anyone who'd listen that breaking the seals would bring catastrophe. No catastrophe came. The town continued. Life went on without Friday night ceremonies. I drive past the community center sometimes and watch children playing in the park where grandmother's house once stood. None of them know what happened beneath that ground. Their parents probably don't tell them about the cult that operated for 7 decades, using supernatural claims to cover murder and fraud. Maybe that's fine. Maybe some stories don't need to be passed down. Maybe the best memorial is letting children play without shadows of the past haunting them. The Friday nights don't own me anymore, and the lies that kept me locked in that bedroom have no power now that truth has burned them away.